In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender. In 2012, a man who would later become Secretary of Commerce visited his island. Years later, that same man was appointed to one of the highest economic positions in the United States government. And today, the Attorney General cannot confirm whether anyone in her department even asked him about it. That is not a memory lapse. That is a collapse of oversight happening in real time. Because what you are about to watch is not a hearing, it is not a debate, and it is definitely not a misunderstanding. This is a stress test of the justice system under pressure, and the system did not hold. The moment Representative Becca Balint began asking direct yes or no questions, the structure of accountability started to fracture. Not slowly, not subtly, but visibly, line by line, answer by answer, refusal by refusal. And the person sitting at the center of that fracture was the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. The question sounded simple because it was simple. Had the Department of Justice asked senior officials about their documented ties to Epstein, yes or no? Not a theory, not a rumor, not political theater, but documented names, dates, and travel records entered into the record. And yet, instead of an answer, what followed was something else entirely. A shift in tone, a shift in posture, and most importantly, a shift away from the question itself. "I'm not asking trick questions," Balint said, and that line matters more than it sounds, because in a room designed for sworn testimony, the only reason to call a question a trick is to avoid answering it. Pam Bondi did not say yes, she did not say no, she said she was stunned. Stunned is not an answer. Stunned is a reaction, and reactions are what people give when the facts are already too dangerous to confront directly. Now watch the sequence carefully, because this is where the hearing stops being procedural and becomes diagnostic. A name is introduced, Howard Lutnick. A position is established, Secretary of Commerce. A connection is referenced, ties to Epstein, documented in unredacted files. And then comes the question that should have ended the sequence in one word, yes or no. But it does not end there. Instead, Pam Bondi redirects to something else, something safer, something already rehearsed. He has addressed those ties himself. That sentence sounds complete, but it is functionally empty because self-reporting is not investigation. In any serious audit, allowing the subject of scrutiny to define their own explanation is not due diligence, it is abdication. And this is where the structure begins to break down under its own weight. Because Balint does not ask once, she asks again, and then again, tightening the frame each time. Did the Department of Justice ask Howard Lutnick? Not did Howard Lutnick speak publicly, not did Howard Lutnick issue a statement, not did Howard Lutnick deny anything. Did the Department of Justice, the entity responsible for enforcing federal law, ask Howard Lutnick directly about those ties? There is still no answer. Instead, the silence starts to accumulate, and silence in this context is not neutral. Silence becomes data. Each non-answer is a data point, each deflection is a pattern, and patterns are what investigators build cases on. Because when three separate officials are named and none of them can be confirmed as having been questioned, the issue is no longer individual, it is systemic, and the names matter here, not as abstractions, but as positions of power. Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce. John Phelan, Secretary of the Navy. Steven Feinberg, Deputy Secretary of Defense. These are not peripheral figures. These are central nodes in the structure of federal authority. According to the unredacted files referenced during the hearing, each of these men has documented ties to Epstein. Not speculative ties, not indirect associations, but entries in records that have now been brought into the public domain. And yet when asked whether the Department of Justice has engaged with them about those ties, Pam Bondi cannot provide confirmation. Not refusal, not denial, just absence. And absence, in this context, is the most revealing answer of all. Now consider the contrast that Balint introduces, because this is where the moral weight of the moment begins to escalate. According to the Department of Justice's own data, a child is sexually abused in the United States every 9 minutes. That statistic is not abstract. It is operational. It defines urgency. It defines priority. It defines why the system exists in the first place. And yet, when confronted with evidence of a multi-decade network involving some of the most powerful individuals in the world, the system hesitates. Not because the evidence is unclear, but because the implications are too clear. This is the contradiction at the center of the hearing. On one side, a declared commitment to justice, repeated in public statements, reinforced in policy language. On the other, a refusal to engage with specific documented cases involving individuals who now hold positions of power. And the gap between those two positions is not theoretical. It is measurable in the silence that fills the room. At one point, the tension becomes so visible that Pam Bondi shifts strategies entirely. Instead of addressing the question, she challenges the premise, labeling the line of inquiry as inappropriate. "This is pathetic," Pam Bondi says, and that word choice is not accidental. Because when you cannot dismantle the evidence, the next step is to discredit the process that brought it forward. But that strategy comes with a cost, because it reframes the hearing from a search for truth into a confrontation over legitimacy. And once that shift happens, the focus is no longer on whether the ties exist, but on whether it is acceptable to ask about them. That is a dangerous inversion because it places the burden not on the subject of the investigation, but on the person asking the question. Becca Balint does not accept that inversion. She pulls the focus back, repeatedly, insistently, almost methodically. "These are not trick questions," Becca Balint says again, and the repetition is intentional. Because in a room where authority is being used to deflect, repetition becomes a tool of resistance. It anchors the conversation to the original issue, refusing to let it drift into irrelevance. And then comes the moment that defines the entire exchange. Becca Balint asks whether the president was aware of Howard Lutnick's ties when making the appointment. It is a direct question, tied to a specific decision, grounded in documented timelines. And again, there is no answer. Instead, there is interruption, deflection, and an attempt to reclaim procedural control. "I'm reclaiming my time," Becca Balint says, and that phrase carries more weight than it appears. Because time, in this context, is not just a procedural allocation, it is a resource of accountability. Every second spent avoiding the question is a second in which the answer remains unspoken. And every unspoken answer contributes to the larger pattern that is now becoming impossible to ignore. Watch how the room reacts, because this is where the dynamics shift beyond the words themselves. The tone changes, the interruptions increase, and the focus begins to scatter. What started as a targeted inquiry into specific ties becomes a broader attempt to redirect the conversation entirely. References to unrelated figures, unrelated votes, unrelated controversies are introduced, and none of them address the original question. This is not random, it is strategic. When the evidence becomes too concentrated, the only way to diffuse it is to expand the frame, to introduce noise, to create distraction, to shift attention away from the point of pressure. And that is exactly what happens when the discussion moves toward figures like Bill Clinton and Joe Biden. Not because they are relevant to the specific question being asked, but because they provide an alternative narrative. But here is the problem with that strategy. It does not erase the original timeline. It does not change the fact that Epstein was convicted in 2008. It does not change the fact that Howard Lutnick visited the island in 2012. And it does not change the fact that, years later, Howard Lutnick was appointed to a cabinet-level position without confirmed scrutiny from the Department of Justice. Those facts remain fixed, regardless of how the conversation shifts around them. And that is why this hearing matters, not as a political spectacle, but as a diagnostic event. Because it reveals not just what the system says it does, but what it actually does when confronted with inconvenient evidence. It shows where the lines of accountability hold, and where they begin to dissolve. And right now, those lines are dissolving in real time. And once those lines begin to dissolve, the next phase is predictable. Because systems under pressure do not simply fail, they reveal how they choose to fail. Not through collapse, but through substitution, replacing direct answers with procedural noise, replacing accountability with performance. And that is exactly what happens the moment Becca Balint introduces the next layer of evidence into the record. Because now the focus is no longer just on whether the Department of Justice asked questions, but on what the Department of Justice already had in its possession. And that is where the word unredacted becomes impossible to ignore. According to the documents referenced in that exchange, these are not partial files, not summaries, not second-hand reports. These are unredacted records tied to Jeffrey Epstein's network, spanning years, jurisdictions, and financial channels. They contain names, travel logs, and associations that have already been verified internally before being brought into that room. So when Becca Balint raises those files, she is not speculating. She is placing certified material into a public forum, and the expectation in that moment is not interpretation. It is confirmation. But instead of confirmation, Pam Bondi moves into a different posture entirely. Not defensive in the traditional sense, but evasive in structure, shifting away from the content of the files toward the framing of the question. This is a critical distinction because when the substance cannot be challenged, the only remaining option is to challenge the context. And that is why the conversation begins to drift toward tone, toward decorum, toward anything that is not the documents themselves. It is a controlled redirection, designed to dilute the concentration of the evidence. Now look at how Becca Balint responds, because this is where the exchange becomes procedural warfare. She does not follow the diversion. She tightens the scope again, returning to the same core demand. Yes or no, has the Department of Justice spoken to these individuals about their ties? Not a speech, not a clarification, not a policy statement, just a binary answer. And in that simplicity lies the pressure, because binary questions remove the space for maneuver. But Pam Bondi does not enter that binary. Instead, she introduces ambiguity where none is required, referencing what those individuals have said publicly. And this is where the logic begins to fracture in a measurable way. Because public statements are not investigative actions, and conflating the two is not an oversight, it is a substitution. It replaces institutional responsibility with individual narrative, and that shift carries consequences. Let's break that down in concrete terms, because this is where the evidence stacking becomes unavoidable. A public statement is controlled by the subject, framed by the subject, and limited by the subject. An investigation, on the other hand, is controlled by the institution, verified independently, and documented under oath. Those are not equivalent processes, and treating them as interchangeable is not a neutral act. It effectively removes the institution from its role and hands it back to the individual being examined. And that is exactly what Becca Balint is exposing in real time. Not by accusing, not by speculating, but by forcing the distinction into the open. When she repeats the question, she is not seeking new information. She is testing whether the system will acknowledge its own standards. And the answer, or more precisely the lack of one, becomes the data point that defines the outcome. Because if the Department of Justice has not conducted those inquiries, then the standard is not being applied. Now the exchange escalates, and the tone shifts again, but this time the shift is not subtle. Pam Bondi begins to express visible frustration, not with the facts, but with the persistence of the questioning. And that reaction is important, because it signals that the pressure is no longer theoretical. It is no longer about managing the narrative. It is about containing the exposure. And containment, by definition, requires limiting the flow of information. This is where the phrase, "this is pathetic," enters the record, and it does more than express emotion. It attempts to redefine the legitimacy of the inquiry itself, framing it as inappropriate rather than unresolved. But that reframing does not eliminate the underlying issue. It simply layers another level of conflict on top of it. Because now the question is not just whether the Department of Justice acted, but whether it is willing to be seen as acting. And that distinction matters when the audience is not just the room, but the public record. Meanwhile, the documents remain unchanged. The timeline remains unchanged. The names remain unchanged. And that is the fundamental problem with deflection in a documented environment. It can shift perception temporarily, but it cannot alter the underlying data. At this point, the hearing reaches a critical threshold because the focus begins to narrow around a specific event. The 2012 trip to Epstein's Island by Howard Lutnick. This is not a vague association. It is a discrete occurrence, tied to a known location, at a time when Epstein's status was already established. And when that event is placed next to the 2008 conviction, the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. It is not ambiguous. It is sequential, and sequences create accountability. So the question evolves, and Becca Balint adjusts accordingly. If the Department of Justice has not asked about the ties, has it at least examined the trip? Not hypothetically, not indirectly, but specifically, has that event been reviewed, documented, or questioned? And once again, the answer does not arrive. Instead, the conversation shifts, the focus widens, and the moment begins to fragment. But fragmentation is not resolution. It is delay. And delay in a system designed to respond to evidence carries its own implications, because every moment that passes without action is a moment in which the standard is not being applied. And when the standard is not applied consistently, it ceases to function as a standard at all. Now we move into what can only be described as narrative substitution. References to other political figures are introduced, not as part of the evidence chain, but as parallel examples. The names of Bill Clinton and Joe Biden enter the discussion, not because they are tied to the specific question, but because they provide an alternative frame. This is a classic redistribution tactic, shifting the burden from a focused inquiry to a generalized debate. And while it can be effective rhetorically, it does not address the original issue, because the original issue is still sitting on the table. 3 senior officials, documented ties, no confirmed inquiries by the Department of Justice, and a timeline that aligns those facts in a way that demands explanation. Becca Balint does not engage with the diversion. Instead, she returns to the central point, and in doing so, she reinforces the structure of the argument. This is not about party affiliation, she makes clear. This is about accountability, and that framing is critical, because it removes the safety of partisan defense. It forces the issue back into the domain of institutional responsibility. At the same time, the moral dimension begins to intensify, because the conversation is no longer confined to documents and procedures. It expands to include the people affected by the failures of that system. Survivors who have waited, not for statements, not for explanations, but for action. And in that context, every deflection takes on additional weight. Because while the exchange unfolds in real time, the consequences extend far beyond that room. They extend into cases that were never pursued, into investigations that were never opened, into questions that were never asked. And that is where the concept of a 2-tiered system stops being abstract. It becomes visible in the contrast between who is questioned and who is not. Now the hearing reaches another inflection point, and it is not driven by new evidence but by accumulated pressure. The repeated inability to confirm basic investigative steps creates a pattern that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It suggests not an oversight, but a boundary, an invisible line that the system is unwilling to cross. And identifying that boundary is essential to understanding how the system operates, because systems do not fail randomly. They fail along predictable lines, shaped by incentives, constraints, and power structures. And when those lines align with positions of authority, the implications become clear. The issue is not whether the system can act, but whether it chooses to act in certain cases. And that choice defines everything that follows. At this stage, the hearing is no longer about extracting answers. It is about documenting the absence of those answers. Every repetition, every deflection, every unanswered question becomes part of the record. And records, unlike statements, do not disappear. They accumulate, they persist, and they eventually demand reconciliation. And that is where we are now, at the point where the accumulation of evidence begins to outweigh the effectiveness of deflection, where the timeline, the documents, and the unanswered questions converge into a single, unavoidable conclusion, not stated explicitly, not confirmed directly, but constructed through the absence itself. And that conclusion is what will carry this hearing into its next phase. And that next phase is where the structure stops bending and starts revealing exactly what it was designed to protect. Because once the absence of answers becomes the evidence itself, the question is no longer what happened in that room. The question becomes what happens outside of it, in the systems that were supposed to act long before this hearing ever took place. And that is where the phrase two-tiered system stops being rhetoric and starts functioning as a measurable reality. Not in theory, not in opinion, but in observable behavior under direct questioning. Let's go back to the sequence, because this is where the pressure becomes undeniable. Becca Balint is no longer introducing new names. She is reinforcing the existing record. Howard Lutnick, John Phelan, Steven Feinberg, all tied through documented associations to Jeffrey Epstein, all holding positions that require the highest level of public trust. And none of them confirmed as having been questioned by the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi's authority. That is not a gap. That is a pattern. And patterns, when they repeat across individuals and departments, are no longer incidental. They are structural. They reflect not just decisions, but priorities. And priorities reveal what a system is willing to confront and what it is determined to avoid. Now watch how the logic tightens, because this is where the prosecutorial mode fully takes over. If Epstein's network is, as described, a multi-decade international conspiracy involving financial crimes, trafficking, and abuse, then every verified connection becomes relevant. Not optional, not contextual, but necessary for a complete investigation. And when those connections lead directly to current government officials, the obligation does not decrease. It increases. So the absence of inquiry is not neutral. It is a deviation from expected procedure. In any standard investigative framework, documented association triggers follow-up. Follow-up triggers interviews. Interviews generate records, and records establish accountability. But here, that chain breaks at the very first step. No confirmed inquiry, no confirmed interview, no confirmed record. And without those steps, the system does not just slow down, it stops. Now consider what that means in practical terms. Because this is not about abstract policy failures, this is about operational decisions. Decisions to pursue or not pursue, to question or not question, to document or leave undocumented. And each of those decisions creates a trail, even when the official record remains silent. This is where the concept of selective enforcement becomes visible without ever being stated. Because enforcement is not defined by what is written in policy manuals. It is defined by what actions are actually taken. And when similar cases produce different responses, the difference becomes the evidence, not of intent, but of outcome. Now layer that against the moral dimension that has been building throughout this exchange. A child is sexually abused every 9 minutes in the United States, according to the Department of Justice itself. That statistic is not a background detail. It is the justification for the system's existence. It defines why investigations are initiated, why resources are allocated, why authority is granted. So when that same system hesitates in the face of documented connections involving powerful individuals, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because the standard applied to ordinary cases appears to dissolve when those cases intersect with authority. And that dissolution is not theoretical. It is visible in the unanswered questions, in the missing confirmations, in the silence that fills the gaps. Now we arrive at the moment where the narrative can no longer sustain itself without contradiction. Pam Bondi continues to emphasize commitment to justice, to accountability, to transparency. But those statements are now directly contrasted by the record established in that room, a record of questions asked and not answered, of evidence presented and not engaged. And when those two layers collide, the result is not ambiguity. It is dissonance, a visible gap between what is claimed and what is demonstrated. And that gap is where trust begins to erode. Let's bring this back to the 2012 trip, because this is where the evidence becomes concrete again. Howard Lutnick's presence on Epstein's island after the 2008 conviction is not an interpretation. It is a documented event referenced in the files. And when placed in sequence, it creates a question that does not require speculation. What did Howard Lutnick see? Who did Howard Lutnick meet? And why has the Department of Justice not confirmed that those questions were ever asked? Those are not complex questions. They are foundational. They are the starting point of any serious inquiry into a network of this scale. And yet, in this case, even the starting point appears to have been bypassed. Now watch how the hearing attempts to absorb that pressure, because this is where the defensive mechanisms become more visible. The conversation continues to expand outward, introducing unrelated topics, unrelated figures, unrelated controversies, not as evidence, but as distraction. And distraction, when repeated, becomes strategy. But strategy has limits, especially when the underlying data remains fixed. Because no matter how many additional narratives are introduced, the original timeline does not change. 2008, conviction. 2012, visit. Subsequent appointment to a cabinet-level position. No confirmed inquiry by the Department of Justice. That sequence is stable. And stability, in the context of contradiction, becomes pressure. Because it forces the system to either reconcile the inconsistency or continue to ignore it. And continued avoidance only amplifies the discrepancy. Now we move into what can only be described as the moral inflection point of the hearing. Because at this stage, the discussion is no longer confined to institutional behavior. It extends to the individuals affected by that behavior. Survivors who have waited, not for political alignment, not for narrative framing, but for acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires action. Not statements, not assurances, but measurable steps. Interviews conducted, records created, questions asked under oath. When those steps do not occur, the absence is not procedural, it is personal. It affects real people, real cases, real outcomes. And that is where the hearing stops being a policy discussion and becomes a moral evaluation. Because the question is no longer whether the system can act. It is whether it chooses to act when the subjects of inquiry hold power. And that choice defines the integrity of the system more than any statement ever could. Now consider the implications beyond this single exchange. Because what is being documented here is not an isolated failure. It is a pattern that can be applied to other cases, other investigations, other decisions. If the standard is not applied here, where the evidence is already established, then where is it applied? And if it is applied selectively, then the concept of equal justice becomes conditional. That is the real issue at the center of this hearing. Not partisan conflict, not rhetorical escalation, but structural consistency. Whether the same rules apply to all individuals, regardless of position, or whether those rules shift when authority is involved. And the answer, based on the record established so far, is not being stated. It is being demonstrated through absence, through deflection, through the repeated inability to confirm basic investigative actions. Now we arrive at the point where the hearing has effectively transformed into its own piece of evidence. Because the behavior observed in that room is no longer separate from the issue being examined. It is part of it. It reflects the same patterns, the same priorities, the same boundaries. And that is why this moment matters. Not because of what was said, but because of what could not be said. Not because of the questions, but because of the answers that never arrived. And in that absence, the system reveals exactly how it operates when it is tested under pressure. And when a system reveals itself under pressure, The final question is no longer whether something went wrong, it is whether anything will be corrected after it has been exposed. Because exposure without consequence is not accountability, it is documentation of tolerance. And what you just watched was not a breakdown. It was a demonstration of how far the system can stretch without snapping. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the enforcement is selective. And selective enforcement is where trust does not just decline, it collapses. Let's return to the center of this, because the details matter more than the reactions. 3 names entered into the record, tied through documented associations to Jeffrey Epstein: Howard Lutnick, John Phelan, Steven Feinberg, each holding positions that require oversight at the highest level. A timeline that places those associations after a known conviction, not before it. And a Department of Justice, led by Pam Bondi, that cannot confirm whether it even asked the first question. That is the baseline. Not interpretation, not exaggeration, just the baseline. And once that baseline is established, everything that follows becomes a matter of consistency. Because the law, if it is to function as law, must operate the same way regardless of who is involved. Otherwise, it is not law, it is discretion disguised as principle. Now consider how this would unfold in any other context. An individual with documented ties to a convicted offender, connected through travel records, appearing in investigative files. That individual would be questioned. That individual would be interviewed. That individual would be part of a documented process designed to establish facts. But here, that process appears to stop before it begins. And that is where the concept of a 2-tiered system moves from accusation to observation. Because the difference is not in the evidence, it is in the response to the evidence. And response is what defines enforcement. Now bring back the moral dimension, because this is where the weight of the moment becomes unavoidable. Every 9 minutes, a child is sexually abused in the United States. That statistic is not just a number, it is a clock that never stops. It measures not just incidents, but failures to prevent those incidents. Failures to investigate, failures to prosecute, failures to hold accountable. And in that context, every unanswered question in that hearing carries a cost. Not a political cost, not a reputational cost, but a human cost. Because each delay, each deflection, each refusal to engage with the evidence contributes to a system that does not respond equally. And unequal response is where justice stops being justice. Now focus on the survivors, because this is the part that is easiest to overlook in a room filled with procedure. They are not watching for rhetoric. They are not measuring tone. They are waiting for action, for acknowledgement that their cases matter enough to be pursued without exception. And what they saw in that room was not action. They saw avoidance. They saw a system that can articulate its mission clearly but struggles to apply it consistently. They saw questions that should have produced answers dissolve into exchanges that produced nothing. And that absence is what defines their experience with the system. Pam Bondi had an opportunity in that moment, not to defend, not to deflect, but to clarify. To say yes, these individuals have been contacted, or no, they have not. And here is why. Either answer would have established a position. But instead, there was neither. And in that neither, the system chose ambiguity over accountability. Because ambiguity allows movement without commitment. It allows the appearance of engagement without the substance of action. Now consider the long-term implications of that choice. Because systems do not operate in isolation, they operate in patterns. And patterns, once established, repeat. If this is the response in a case with this level of visibility, what is the response in cases that never reach a hearing room? What happens to evidence that is never presented, to questions that are never asked? This is where the hearing expands beyond its immediate context. It becomes a reference point, a benchmark for how similar situations will be handled in the future. And if the benchmark is silence, then silence becomes the standard. Now we arrive at the final layer, the one that sits beneath all the others. Trust. Not political trust, not institutional loyalty, but basic confidence that the system functions as intended. That when evidence is presented, it is examined. That when questions are asked, they are answered. Because without that, the entire structure becomes unstable. Not visibly at first, not immediately, but gradually, as each unanswered question accumulates, as each inconsistency compounds, until the system no longer needs to be challenged from the outside, because it has already undermined itself from within. And that is where this leaves us, with a record, not of what was proven, but of what was avoided, with a sequence, not of actions taken, but of actions deferred, with a system, not collapsing, but revealing the conditions under which it chooses not to act. So the question is no longer about Pam Bondi. It is no longer about Becca Balint. It is about whether the rules that govern everyone else apply at the highest levels of power, or whether those rules shift when enforcement becomes inconvenient. Because if they shift, then the system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. And that design is what needs to be examined next. So ask yourself this. If the Department of Justice cannot confirm that it has asked basic questions about documented ties to one of the most infamous criminal networks in modern history, what else has it chosen not to ask? What else has it chosen not to see? And what does that mean for every case that depends on equal enforcement of the law? Drop your thoughts below. Do you believe Pam Bondi is protecting the system or protecting the people inside it? Should every official named in those files be formally investigated under oath? And if the answer is yes, why hasn't it already happened? Like the video if you believe accountability should not depend on status. Share it with someone who still thinks the system applies equally to everyone. And subscribe, because we are going to keep following this paper trail until every unanswered question is forced into the light.